obedience of everyone, both those who are justified
about the moral.
And so, again, by way of review, can the moral law be adjusted?
God decide upon the moral law? That's a bit trickier. Did God decide upon it? Or is it just who he is? It's who he is. The moral law cannot, and I can't stress this enough, it cannot possibly be anything other than what it is. God himself cannot change the moral law. Okay? He can't. It would be impossible, because that would require a change of God's character, and that is, of course, impossible. There are many things God cannot do, and denying his own holiness is one of them. Okay? So this is regarding the moral law. It forever requires obedience of everyone, both those who are justified as well as others. Okay, so who is obligated to honor marriage? Believers or unbelievers? Everyone. Who is required to observe a 6-in-1 pattern of work and rest? That's just for Christians, right? I mean, we can't have laws about that, right? Everyone. It's in creation. It's made in creation. It's just there. So it cannot possibly be anything other than what it is. Okay? And it forever requires obedience of everyone, both those who are justified as well as others. And we can flesh that out in a bit here, but why don't we work through these texts first? So who wants to take Romans 13, 8 through 10? And James 2, 8 through 12. Who wants to take that? Nathan. Okay. Go ahead, Carter. Romans 13, 8 through 10. Okay, that's great. You see there in the teaching of Paul himself that love is the fulfilling of the law. Now, people can understand that two different ways, one of which I think is perfectly accurate and one I think is very misguided. Here's one from an actual conversation. This is actual. This isn't a hypothetical. That because of love, now, I can, basically I can do whatever I want because it's motivated by love, right? And actual conversation, me and my wife decided together that we would have a polyamorous marriage. So no one's sensibilities are offended here. We're both okay with this. No violence is being done to anyone, okay? No violence is being done to anyone. We're in agreement with this, and besides, it's just out of love. There's so much love that it just kind of spills the banks of our marriage. Okay? So, is that love fulfilling the law in the sense of the seventh commandment is no longer operative? Is that a correct interpretation? Can you do that? Can you say, as long as my intentions are loving, I'm free to break the letter of the law? Can we do that? No. Sometimes people have a really mistaken notion about the spirit and the letter of the law. To just observe the letter without understanding, without heartfelt obedience, is hypocrisy. That's what the Pharisees did. But understanding the heart of the law does not give you permission to break the letter of the law. Okay? Oh, well, now I get it. Like, I get what marriage is all about now, and it's about love, and I get it. It's so wonderful. So now that I get the heart of the law, now, of course, I'm free to break the letter of the law. That's silly. That doesn't work. To say that love is the fulfilling of the law means that when we love the Lord, when we love his law, we understand it, and so the obedience is not just external and hypocritical, it's heartfelt. It's sincere obedience. Okay, so the heart and the letter of the law are not opposed to one another. The letter of the law gives form, it gives structure, it gives an accurate picture of what's in the heart of the law. But the heart of the law does not give you permission to break what God just outright set there. Okay? I think that's a fairly self-evident concept, but maybe not. I'll stop right there. And have you seen that approach? That as long as it's motivated by some kind of sentiment of love, that everything's okay? Right? It's all good? Have you guys encountered that? Love is love, we hear. Yeah. And then we have to answer back. By what standard? Who defines love? Where would we go to find out what love is? Okay? In the words of Foreigner, I want to know what love is. Okay? Classic rock fans will remember. The rest of you, it's lost. I'm sorry. Okay? So there is a standard of love. And Paul says here in verse 10, love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. And that fits with what Jesus says in John 15. If you are my friends, you will keep my commandments. Okay? Love does not give you a hall pass to break God's law. Love helps you to understand the heart behind God's law so that we don't obey hypocritically, but that we obey with a clear conscience, that we obey with our heart. Okay? That we see the goodness in God's law. Like Psalm 119. We see that it's good, it's wonderful, it's not a killjoy for us, but rather it's to motivate us. More discussion on that. What's loving? So essentially the question is, how do we show love to people who are actively in sin? Okay, so you're talking about a misguided definition of love. Okay, so here is a question. This is a thought experiment. Is it possible for two men in a homosexual relationship to love each other? Is love possible in such an arrangement? This is going to really tear at the sentimental notions of love in our culture. It's impossible. It's self-love. It's love with a mirror. It is impossible for two people in a same-sex relationship to love each other. They may very well have warm feelings towards each other. They may think they love each other, but if God controls the dictionary, and he does, it is absolutely impossible for people in a sinful arrangement like that to love each other. Because if we think, I like John Piper's way of paraphrasing this, love means looking after the interests of someone that has their best in mind in 10,000 years from now. And if you are doing something with someone that is going to throw you both into hell, that is not love. Okay? Adultery is incapable of love. Same-sex relationships are incapable of love. Fornication is incapable of love. None of those are loving. There may be warm and sentimental, and we have kind feelings, but that's not love if God controls the dictionary. And again, he does, because love is the fulfilling of the law. And so if we're doing things with someone, no matter how warm our heart is about it, because our heart can lie to us, if we're doing something that is not in someone's eternal best interest, it's not. It really is not loving. Gideon. Okay, so Gideon's asking, and that's actually very relevant here to bring this back to the main point. So Gideon's asking, what about two non-Christians, a man and a woman, unbelievers? Can they love each other? And I would say the understanding won't be as great as a Christian couple. But the unbelieving couple, we're talking like a normal heterosexual couple here, are not violating the laws of nature. They're still obeying reality. They're obeying nature. Because when we're talking about things here like God's moral law or God's natural law, marriage is one of those things that God baked into creation for believers and unbelievers. So when unbelievers get married, I'd say that's a good thing. It's better than actively sinning. Of course, for them to really understand what they're doing, they should become Christians. So they would understand the richness and the fullness of their marriage. But they're not sinning against creation, if that makes sense. Whereas you are sinning against creation if you enter into a one-flesh union with someone without any kind of covenant bonds, right? So to fornicate is unnatural. It's wrong. But there's nothing immoral about two unbelievers marrying each other. It's still good from a creational standpoint. It's just not getting to the bottom of what marriage is. They won't understand what they're doing, but they are obeying nature. Am I understanding that correctly? Yeah? Okay. And I know does this strike a little hard when the word love has strategically been redefined and used as a weapon against us because Christians of all people should be loving, okay? So if I wanted to steer Christians, I would absolutely go after the dictionary and I would pick words like love and tolerance to redefine, to steer Christians. But we have to think sharply about this. Lisa. Yeah, I agree. Lisa's saying that even in a natural man-woman marriage, if there's no Christ there, you are lost, right? So this analogy might not work, but I'm just thinking of a word picture on my feet. We could say that the car might still drive, but we have no idea where we're going. Whereas believers, the car works, and we have a clear idea of where we're going. There's a mission. That's right. You as Christians understand what's being communicated in marriage, and it's far more than just being roommates and having kids together, right? It's about displaying the gospel of Christ. So you can understand that. Unbelievers, they can't see past, well, this is like a good domestic arrangement. It's like stable way to raise kids. True, but they can't see nearly all the way down. They'll never experience the depth of marriage. They'll never enjoy that. But all I'm saying is that if two unbelievers get married, that's an actual marriage, right? They're obeying creation. They're obeying God's moral law, whereas it would be completely impossible for any same-sex coupling to have that. There is no marriage there. It just simply doesn't exist, right? Because it's a denial of reality. It's a denial of creation. There was another hand somewhere. So Dave's just pointing out the irony of people who use do not judge as a comment against legalism tend to be quite legalistic in their understanding and application of Matthew 7 verse 1, which is the Bible verse that controls all others. Yeah, right? Yeah. Yeah, so in a sense, instead of highlighting that Bible verse in yellow, you highlight all the other ones with a black Sharpie, right? There's only one verse in the Bible. Yeah. No, we want to understand this together, definitely. Okay, so moral law, again, is for believers and unbelievers. There's certain things that God just baked into creation, and since all people are downstream of creation, this applies just as much to people in 2nd century Peru as it does in 21st century North America. There are no exceptions. Everyone is downstream from creation in all times, in all places. So things like marriage, things like work, things like rest, things like raising children, that's just natural, and it's for everyone. It's not just for Christians. Let's read the other passage here. James 2, 8 through 12. You had that right, Nathan? Yeah, go ahead. Okay, very good. Thank you, Nathan. This is a rich passage because there's several kind of common catchphrases or kind of little sayings that are addressed in here. First of all, James is talking about us being under the law, but now it's under the law of liberty in the gospel. So on this side of the cross, this law is a law of liberty, not of bondage. Okay? So this is a freeing law. Okay? So is it legalistic and a joy kill to say, do not commit adultery? Is that because God is standing up in heaven making sure that no one ever has fun on earth? Okay? Is God this cosmic buzzkill? No? H.L. Mencken, who was a notorious unbeliever, and not just an unbeliever, but someone who made it his life's work to mischaracterize and trash Christians, defined the Puritans as those people who were worried that someone somewhere might be enjoying themselves. Okay? And if you read the Puritans, that's absolutely not even remotely the case. They were all about joy and talking happily about life and family and the marriage bed and food and work and all the rest of it. Okay? So this is not God being a buzzkill. This is God instructing us to do what will bring him the most glory and us the most good, which happens to be the exact same thing. But notice this, on this side of the cross, on this side of the gospel, James is saying the 10 Commandments are obsolete now, right? No. He's appealing to them. See? It's right there. Haven't gone anywhere. God's moral law has not changed on this side of the cross. God will give you a heart to understand it in a way that even Moses himself couldn't understand it. So people in this room can understand what's behind the law in a way that Moses could not. Okay? That's why it's the law of liberty. It's freeing. We see how this is good for us now. We can delight in it. But it's not abolished. It's not blown up. It's not annihilated. It's still there. Many times in the New Testament, you have New Testament writers appealing back to the moral law that was revealed either at creation or in the 10 Commandments and saying this is good. This is still the case. Okay? It's still there. It hasn't moved. God's character hasn't changed. It's impossible for his moral law to be altered in any way. Okay? And again, we've talked in the past about the ceremonial laws and so forth that are clearly terminated. We're talking about the moral law here, the heart behind it all. Okay? And the ceremonial laws were just particular instances to demonstrate this in a particular culture at a particular time. But the heart behind it, the moral nature of the law does not change, cannot change. God himself can't do it. But I'm going to also bring up one thing here, James, what Nathan just read. Verse 10, to verse 10. For whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become accountable for all of it. Remember this, all sins are equal. Okay? I'm guessing more than us. We're just maybe not brave enough to put our hands up. But we've all heard that. Is that what's being taught here? 2 verse 10 saying all sins are equal? No. No, they're not. What is James saying? So positively first, what is James saying? You're guilty. The smallest sin can condemn you, but that's not saying the smallest sin is the same as the biggest sin. Okay? Not at all. Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount that adultery begins when? In the heart. Okay? When you take a second prolonged look, that's when adultery starts. So, is a wise course of action, well, since I'm guilty of adultery in my heart, I may as well just go do it. After all, I'm already guilty. If God's going to hang me for an adulterer, I may as well have some fun on my way to the gallows, right? Is that what he's saying? No, not at all. There are degrees of sin. Not all sins are equally serious, okay? This is not teaching that all sins are equally serious. This is saying rather that any sin, even the small ones, are enough to condemn us. They're enough to establish the fact that we don't have a righteousness of our own. Okay? But it's not saying that all sins are equal in terms of their severity, or that they're equal in terms of their consequences in our own life or in others, or even that God will punish them all equally. In Luke 12 or 13, I forget now exactly where, Jesus says that the one servant will receive a light beating and another a severe beating. The more light you have, the more egregious the sin, the more punishment fits it. Okay? Heaven and hell are not egalitarian. There's degrees of reward in heaven and there's degrees of punishment in hell according to the severity of the sin. I think that's a biblical teaching. So, again, this isn't saying everything's equal. This is saying if you're guilty of one, your guilt is established. You may as well be guilty of them all in terms of God's courtroom, but it's not saying everything is equal in terms of its severity or the intention even behind it. I'm going to stop there. Does that make sense? Yeah. Right. Okay, so Marina's bringing up a very good and important point, and probably one that's clarified. Sometimes I say things with certain assumptions in my head, and then I realize not everyone's assuming the same background things as I am. To be clear, there is absolutely zero punishment on the other side of eternity for Christians. None. Purgatory is an invention of man. It does not exist. There is no punishment on the other side of glory. So all Christians enter into glory and reward. Christians, however, on this side of eternity do experience temporal consequences for our sin, right? That if Christians touch an element on a stove, we get burned just as bad as an unbeliever, right? If we do sinful things, there's going to be harmful consequences. But none of that carries over for a Christian into the afterlife. The sin is taken care of in that sense, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah, no believer is punished in eternity, not even in the slightest. Christ took that once for all. For an unrighteous person whose sins have not been atoned for by Christ, I do believe the biblical teaching is there are degrees of severity. Right? I do think that's what Jesus is teaching. The more light you have, the more severe the punishment. Right? I do believe that's the plain teaching of Luke chapter, I think it's 12. But for Christians, no, that is not the case. Temporal consequences may happen. And forfeiting rewards in heaven can also happen for Christians. And I think we don't think about that a whole lot, that there are degrees of reward in heaven. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, there's no punishment for us. But I think if we're truly living on the fuel that we're designed to run on, which is God's glory, why would we not want to maximize our level of reward in heaven? Right? To send our treasure on ahead of us. Yes, I agree. It is. The scraggliest sinner will be perfectly satisfied in heaven. But the longer we walk with the Lord, the more we should say, why wouldn't I want to send as much treasure ahead as possible for God to get maximum glory in the way he worked in my life, right? Christians should think that way, but you're right. There's only two, even if there's degrees of reward and punishment, there's only two outcomes, guilty or innocent in God's courtroom. That's it. There's heaven and hell. There's nowhere else in that sense. That's absolutely true. More on this. That sometimes these phrases that we have that are quick and memorable do as much harm as good if we're not careful in how we think about them. So Dave mentioned, if you didn't hear it, he mentioned specifically the example of love the sinner but hate the sin, which of course there's lots of truth to that, right? We don't know someone's heart. We don't know what God's going to do in their life tomorrow, so we need to be patient. We need to be long-suffering. We need to be loving. And there is a sense, of course, in which God does love everyone, right? He sends his rain on the just and on the unjust. But that's a long step to say that God loves everyone in a saving way. Because Dave is correct. And it says explicitly in the Bible, multiple times, and this is uncomfortable, God hates the violent man. It doesn't say God hates the violence. He does. God hates the man. He hates him. God is angry at the wicked all day long. That's just as much in the Bible as God sends rain on the just and on the unjust. There is a sense in which God hates not just the sin, God hates the sinner. He really does. Okay? God does not give people their just deserts in hell of people that he has set his saving love on. That's just not the case. So we have to hold those together somehow. It's not the sin that goes to hell, it's the sinner. Okay? So the only way we can separate sin and sinner is through the gospel. But whoever has not reached out to the saving grace of Christ, their sin is not removed from them. God sees sin and sinner as all one bundle for that person. It's a hypothetical separation when we come to the gospel that sin and sinner are separated and we become righteous. But for the unjustified, we have to think carefully about the whole biblical data here. God's angry at the man, not just at what he does. He's angry at the man. Okay, there was a hand here, Sonia? That's right. And so the truth of that statement is we can't see what God sees, right? So we have to operate with what we know in good faith and be patient and long-suffering. Even in human relationships, I think there does come a point at which we say, you got to go your own way, right? But you're right, we don't see what God sees. But I think one of the dangers of that saying is we take something that is true in a sense, both for God and for us, and we so impose it onto God that we get this picture that God is just equally head over heels in love with everybody, and he's bawling his eyes out when he has to send someone to hell because it goes against everything in his fiber. It's not. He's doing everything according to his nature when he renders final judgment, right? So it's one of those things where a simple little saying does an injustice because you can't capture sometimes complex biblical ideas in 140 characters, unfortunately. Okay? So Twitter theology is concise, but it's not always very accurate. We have to just think carefully about these things rather than just kind of accepting catchphrases. That's all I'm advocating for. More on this. Then let's keep trucking. After note 10. This obligation arises not only because of its content, but also because of the authority of God the Creator who gave it. And there again, we're in James 2, 10, and 11. We read those already, so we can just stay right there. Whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become accountable for all of it. For he who said, "Do not commit adultery," also said, do not murder. And if you do not commit adultery but do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. And so I think this is just, we've already kind of discussed that. One word picture that kind of works for me is, can picture, well, we kind of have replicas of these. These are some 8-paned windows. They're not actually 8 panes, but they're made to look like 8-pane windows, okay? Take an actual old barn window that has 8 actual panes on it, and you chuck a rock through one of those panes. Is the window broken? Yeah. Equally at each point? No, of course not. But the window is broken. Okay? You commit a transgression against God's law, you are broken. Equally broken in every area? No, of course not. I'm sure some areas of your life are under control. Okay? But enough that you can say this person is broken. This window is broken. Okay? That's, I think, what James is teaching here. The whole man is under judgment if we violate God's law at one point, and all of us have. So James is establishing our guilt here to bring us to the gospel so that that can get put back together again. Yeah. Yep. No, that's Don's just saying, if you didn't hear that. Another way to phrase the same exact thing is that a pass in God's courtroom is 100%. So if you get 99.9%, you fail. Okay? Which shows the foolishness of trying to save ourselves by the law. Staying under the yoke of the law and trying to work our way to heaven is nonsense. If you were supposed to swim from, breaststroke your way from England to North America, it doesn't matter whether you made it 1 mile or 10 miles. You're sunk. You're sunk. Okay? It has to be by grace. We will not make it on our own. We will not make it by law keeping. Never. Our guilt needs to be established so we can go to the gospel. Yeah, Vern is absolutely onto something extremely important. I think he feels lost for words to explain it. I always do, because it's one of those things that just has to click in our mind. But if we take any view of reality which is not self-consciously biblical, from Genesis 1:1, the wheels will come off. if there is any view of reality in which God is a piece that fits in the big circle of reality, you're lost. It might take you 50 years to work out the consequences of your bad ideas, but you are lost. Any unbelieving presupposition that you try to squeeze the Bible into, your goose is cooked. You cannot recover except for a complete biblical cosmology. And I know I sometimes harp on cosmology, but it's for that reason. I'm trying to make it contagious. There is no way to understand reality and then tame God and domesticate him into reality, right? And I think with what Vern is saying, let's say regards to creation, if the universe itself is the self-sustaining eternal thing or something that brought itself into existence, that means God is part of the stuff that's inside the system. And you run into all kinds of problems. I'll give you one very theological one. The doctrine of election is only hard if God is one of the things in the system. If we are all the colored balls on the pool table and God is the white ball, the only way you can displace the purple ball is by the white ball coming with greater force, making us robots. That's why we object to the doctrine of election, because before we even start thinking about that, we think of God as being in the system with us, and the only way he can move me is through power. We have this Islamic view of God's force, but God's not in the system. God's outside of the system. The system is just stuff that God put there. And the author can do whatever he wants with his characters and with his story, and no violence done to any of the characters because they're there by his good pleasure. No violence is done to the creature. God is not the biggest fish in the ocean. God is not the most forceful ball on the pool table. God is. And he's outside of his creation, and then all the stuff inside there. And so when it comes to God's law, I think if we start with unbelieving presuppositions, but then we try to squeeze the Bible into it, you could get the impression that reality was just moving along fine, right? There's reality, there's a cosmos, there's natural law that exists on its own. God came into the system at some point, and he tripped across this cardboard box that said natural law on it. And then God opens up this cardboard box and he says, oh yeah, no, that's a good idea. I'll go with that. And yeah, no, that's not such a good idea, right? As though the cosmos was the self-sustaining thing. It's not. Okay? The stuff in the system is different than the creator who put it there. And this is so important. And this is why when Ken Ham and some of those guys say, if you go wrong on Genesis 1:1, the wheels absolutely fall off on every doctrine imaginable. So I am not very tolerant at all towards theistic evolution. We can quibble about the exact age of the earth within a margin of error, I suppose. But this autonomous view of man, or this autonomous view of history or the cosmos, it's a bad business, and it goes nowhere good. It's absolutely a liberalizing force in the church. No question. No question. Yep. No, I was just saying too that by what standard question persists. You always have to push your thinking back to starting principles. By what standard do you know this is wrong? By what standard would you define love that way? By what standard is this tolerance? By what standard can we say this is right or wrong? We always have to ask that question. And that answer has to terminate in God himself. For every question, it has to terminate in God himself. It must, or we get lost. Words do not possibly do justice to this topic, but I'm hopeful. Is the picture coming into focus a little bit about autonomy and how destructive it is in our thinking? Is that coming into focus? Or is this very abstract and hard to grasp? We're a quiet crowd this morning. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, so Margaret is pointing out the consequences, the disastrous consequences on a personal and on a bigger level, societal level, when we break God's law. When the wheels come off, the wheels come off. Like there is no brakes on this train, right? And I like what one theologian had said, really, because God's law is a fixed, immovable point, which is God himself, really, when we break God's law, we break against God's law. God's law is not going anywhere. It's not budging. It's not even going to crack. You kick against it, you will crack. Right? So it would be more accurate to say we are the ones who break up against God's law rather than that God's law is broken. It's not going anywhere. Okay? You will destroy yourself and not God with adultery. You will destroy yourself and not God with envy. That's how it works. God sits in the heavens. He does all that he pleases. But when we defy reality as God made it, boy, there's a world of hurt for us, right? And as Michael Scott says in The Office, I'm going to make this way harder than it needs to be, right? Says almost every person on earth. Okay? Why would we do this the easy way when I can learn the hard way and have lots of bad consequences on the way? But that is the unbelieving mindset. Let's do one more here. Well, actually, no, that's probably a bigger point, so we'll maybe just bring it in right there. That any closing remarks, any last comments here before we close it up? This is actually quite important to me. This concept of reality and God as the fixed point, is that coming into focus? I'm trying to find ways to explain it, and I'm not sure if I'm making it contagious or not. That reality does not exist apart from God, and then God's in the system. The system is what God made it to be. And he's outside of it. He's above it. He's the author of the story. Why don't we close in prayer, and then we can carry on. Father God, we want to thank you for your goodness. Thank you for your kindness. Thank you for who you are, and that you are the fixed point of all creation. Lord, everything, every part of reality orbits around you and the way you have made things to bring glory to your name, to glorify yourself. And I thank you that even though we have been broken by sin, I thank you that we can be given eyes to see and that we can find our way back and live the way we were meant to live through the gospel. Lord, and I pray that we would further have that gospel reach into the recesses and the corners of our heart, that we can know the joy of living life the way it was meant to be lived and to be running on the fuel that you designed us for, to see our purpose is really to live for your glory, and that is also what will bring us maximum joy. Lord, help us now, and I pray that you'd be with us as we have a time of coffee and fellowship and also prepare our hearts for corporate worship. Thank you for your kindness. Minister to us this morning. We pray this all in the strong name of Jesus, and amen.